So how many people in the room work in law enforcement? Good. How many people on the retail side? All right, so a lot of retail people in the room. So the way I designed this presentation, I'm going to kind of walk you through a little bit. Is this working? And kind of walk you through a little bit what it is we do, both loss prevention and talk a little bit about public sector. Transition from that to an interesting dialogue around crime in America. Joe LAAORCA talked about it this morning. I'm going to go into it a little bit more detail. But every year, the FBI publishes a crime report. It's called the Uniform Crime Report. That crime report analyzes crime in the United States, and they've been doing it now since 1960. I'm going to take that data, I'm going to compare property crime with criminal crime, and hopefully at the end of that, be able to draw some correlations between why it's so important for both public and private to work together to solve crime. There's going to be some analysis in there that might open up your eyes about the correlation between the two. But before I do all of that, I wanted to open up a little bit by just sharing with you how I got involved in loss prevention. And it actually started out much like many of the people in our industry, didn't start out with a plan to be in loss prevention. So I was in college. The year was 1989. Yes, I know some of you guys were really young then. I was in college then. And interestingly enough, I was in college at an interesting time from a crime standpoint. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I grew up in New York City. I lived throughout New York City, living in the city, and then eventually living in Westchester County, New York. And obviously, I went through New York at a time when crack cocaine in the early 80s was really tough. Late 70s, early 80s. Rough area to be, rough areas to be. And it gave me a unique understanding of how crime can impact a community, how people can make simple mistakes, but that simple mistake can have an awful impact on their lives. And I became very intrigued by this issue of crime in America. And so I went away to college, and one of the things I did was we had an internship program that allowed you to work at various district attorney's offices throughout the state of New York. I did that. Going back, one of the district attorney's offices I worked in was in New York City. And while working there was a transition in government. We had a mayor going out, and Rudy Giuliani and Commissioner Bratton were coming in. Commissioner Bratton, the same commissioner that would go on to be commissioner of LA. He previously had been commissioner in Boston. And there was a controversial process they were putting in place. They called them quality of life crimes, nuisance crimes, and they also had a zero tolerance policy. Previously, if you had been caught shoplifting in New York City, what would generally happen is, unless it was a felony or a significant crime, you would generally be stopped by loss prevention people, brought back into the store, go through a process. And what would happen would be, generally you'd be given what was called a disappearance ticket, and you'd be sent on your way. You can imagine that really wasn't an effective deterrent for crime at that moment. One of the things that changed during the administration was this concept that said, going forward, what we're going to do is we're going to put everybody through the process. What through the process meant that for most of the people, you were going to end up downtown, you were going to be fingerprinted, you were going to go through the process, you're going to end up going. So what you can imagine what that did for us working at the district attorneys. I was an intern, so we generally got the grunt work in terms of processing all of that paperwork. And there was a gentleman, again, at this time I'm working at district attorneys, there was a gentleman who worked for loss prevention. And his name was Kevin. I'm not going to give his last name. He actually still works in the industry. And he kept coming back every day with new cases, shoplifting cases. Some days they'd be small cases, and every once in a while there'd be a big case. And one day he came in, and I don't remember the exact amount, but it was over $10,000 larceny. And so immediately I said, Kevin, $10,000 in the store? Well, it was an employee theft. He said, yeah, we caught an employee, $10,000. It's actually a string. I'm going to be giving you 4 more today. So they ended up bringing in. So they were doing interviews. So I became intrigued. So I said to Kevin, Kevin, what do you do? He goes, well, I work in loss prevention. I said, yeah, no, but what do you do? He goes, well, you know, I do a little auditing. I walk the floors. I do awareness programs. He gave me what sounded at that point to be an incoherent definition of what he did. So I walked away more curious than I was before, not completely understanding what he did, but knowing that every single day he was putting me to work. So now obviously we're getting cases on all kinds of things, including felonies, but this person kept intriguing me because he'd come back and they'd be different investigations. It just sounded interesting to me. So Kevin comes back a couple weeks later and said, well, how did you get into this? He goes, well, actually, I want to be in the FBI, but I'm waiting to get through my test, so I'm doing this part-time. But it's a lot of fun. Okay. So long story short, eventually, I needed a part-time job. Guess where I went? So, but what was interesting was I was intrigued by his reaction to my question. Simple question. So, what do you do? If you were a teacher, and I asked you that question, you'd say, I'm a teacher at public schools such and such. I work at a university at such and such. If you were a store manager and I asked you that question, say I'm a store manager at such and such. Would make no difference what company or retailer you work for, you were a store manager. People would intuitively understand what you said. If you were law enforcement and you said, oh yeah, I work, I'm a detective in LAPD. Again, simple question, simple answer. Try that with a loss prevention executive. Try it today. Walk up to it, asset protection, loss prevention person, go, well, what is it that you do? And they end up in this inevitable conflict, right? They can give you a simple answer, but the simple answer generally means they're going to have to guess and hope that maybe you understand retail, maybe you understand what they do. That will generally be prompt to respond something to the effect of, did you catch up with this? That'll be the quick response. Or they'll get into an involved dialogue with you about what it is that they do. But generally speaking, you will find that it's not a simple question, simple answer scenario as it was in the other stuff. And it's because in other industries, the terms are ubiquitous. They transcend all the industries. In our industry, we have a bit of a conflict. I'm going to get back to that. In 2009, there was an article written in LP magazine that dealt with this whole issue of defining our industry. What is it that we do? And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that came out of that. And the article was something I put together in partnership with having talked to a lot of people in the industry. But let's talk a little bit about the industry itself. Let's just talk a little bit about researching our industry. So if you did a Google search on us, which is quite popular, or a search on Bing, and you typed in the words loss prevention, in about 0.11 seconds or 11/10 of a second, you will get 27 million hits on loss prevention. Pretty significant. Do a similar Google search on the term security, you'll get about 100 million hits in less than 1/10 of a second. Type asset protection, you'll get roughly, I think I played it out last night, you'll get roughly 14 million hits, the majority of which, by the way, have nothing to do with asset protection, some of which are inappropriate. But you'll get quite a few hits. But what you'll find is you will struggle to find a definition on there that the industry, that those that work in the industry and understand it, can unite around or understand. So what I did for the purposes of this dialogue is I gave you a popular search engine. So what I did was I typed loss prevention, and then I went in and looked at Wikipedia, which has become very popular. Every single time my daughter needs to do a research project, she goes to Wik, and I have to constantly remind her, that's not a documented site. You can't use that as a reference. She's like, well, it's in Wik. It doesn't mean it's real. But anyway, since it's good enough for Sade, my daughter, it's good enough for us. So Wikipedia, and here's the definition that Wikipedia had. I won't go into detail, but basically it says retail loss prevention, and some retailers known as asset protection, is a form of private investigation into larceny or theft. The focus of such investigations generally includes shoplifting, package pilferage, embezzlement, credit fraud, check fraud. Loss prevention, or LP, is used to describe a number of methods used to reduce the amount of all losses and shrinkage often related to retail trade. Involved definition, if you ask people in our profession, does that define what you do? They're probably going to look at it and go, not quite. A little bit more complicated than that. Now let's talk about what we call ourselves. That's also interesting, right? Because, and I just took a few, there are a lot more terms, but if you started early in this industry around generally the term security, private security, some people might say private investigations, as you saw in the Wikipedia definition, retail security were the general terms that existed in the industry. I'll talk a little bit about the transition and why these terms changed, but here are the terms that you'll hear now, and quite frankly, these are the American terms. If you went abroad, the terms are actually more interesting. I spent some time with Polo starting the LP program there in Europe and in Asia, and I was intrigued by the fact that the terminology were completely different. Some things were common, but even the term shrink and losses became an interesting dynamic. But long story short, loss prevention is quite popular. You'll hear it in retail. You'll hear it in the hotel sector. You will hear it in the food industry. Loss control, it's a popular term in banks. Security is the more popular term in bank. Asset protection is a term that it's emerged. Assets protection is a variation off of that. Security, still the majority term for non-law enforcement, private sector. Still the majority term. In retail, you could argue it may not be the majority term anymore. But if you went outside of retail, you'll find it's still the majority term. So one of the reasons why we struggle to tell you what we do is because we can't all agree on what we call ourselves. Interesting. Who do we work for? Well, I did an interesting contrast. I contrasted public sector, private sector. So on the public side, which is the right-hand side, it's taxpayer revenue driven. It's a governmental agency. Most law enforcement operates on the executive wing of the branches of government, generally reporting up into the mayor, the governor, etc. We generally have the ability to fire the mayor or the governor via voting. Many of you guys may want to do that soon, just saying. But generally speaking, that's the accountability. The accountability is through the executive wing. The other parts, the legislature and the judicial wings, become a part of the process. So one writes the laws, the other one obviously gives the consequences behind it. And generally in law enforcement, the reporting structure up is a chief of police or commander, police commander. It's generally what it looks like. How's that different on our side? Well, the revenue stream is customer driven. It's non-governmental, private. The accountability is generally, I'm going to come back to the customers in a second, but it's generally shareholders, owners, lien holders, investors, board of directors, C-class executives, which we refer to as generally CEO, CFO, COO, Chief Operating Officer. Those are the C-class executives. That's generally where we report into. It varies by company which line you end up, but at the end of the day, you end up in a C-class.